this term Amiyyat in the singular, Amiyyat in the plural, used to refer to a number of popular armed rebellions that take place in what's now Lebanon, but also other parts of Bilad al-Sham, Ottoman-ruled Syria in the 19th century. And the term indicates that these are rebellions of the ordinary people, commoners, Amma, rather than the elites, the groups who are usually involved in ruling that part of the world at the time. So the first of these rebellions, these movements, which are referred to as Amiyyat, are also the ones that I'm most interested in, that I know most about, which are two of these movements which take place in the year 1821 in the northern part of Mount Lebanon. And they are basically protesting against the imposition of new, higher taxes by the ruler of Mount Lebanon at the time, Amir Bashir Shahabi. The first of these is in the spring of 1821, based around the village of Antalya, little way north of Beirut on the coast. The second one is in the village of Lahbed, further north in the hills above Shbil. And these, again, involve the gathering of commoners, ordinary peasants, mostly from the northern part of Mount Lebanon, Maronite Christians, in arms to protest against these taxes. And the first of them leads to the brief deposition of Amir Bashir Shahabi. He goes into exile during the summer of 1821. Then he comes back and he suppresses the second rebellion by force in the autumn of 1821. So these are the first of these events, which are referred to as Amiyyat. Amiyyat Antalya and Amiyyat Lahbed. These words are applied to them retrospectively in that sense. That is, people didn't refer to this as the Amiyyah of Antalya at the time, for instance. But what you can see happening at the time in the language used by the participants in these leagues, these rebellions, and by others, members of the elite who are observing them, is a change in the language, change in the way in which these terms like Amiyyah and others are being used, which I think indicates the beginnings of this new sense of the term Amiyyah to mean a commoner league, a commoner collectivity. So previously you can see it being used simply as a plural, Amiyyah, the same as Amma, referring to commoners as a group. Gradually you see it transforming in association with other words like Jumhur, which means a mass of people, but towards this meaning of a commoner collectivity, a commoner group to which one can owe allegiance and loyalty, rather than owing allegiance or loyalty to a particular notable faction or a house of elite notables who were involved in ruling most of Mount Lebanon at that time. So the term itself is changing. Amiyyah is acquiring this new meaning during 1821, and it transmits that meaning and other aspects of its political organisation and language on to later movements which take up this term and, calling themselves the Amiyyah and so on, later on in the 19th century. So I had been studying prior to this mainly the intellectual life of the Arab world in the middle part of the 19th century, so from about 1830 to 1870, thereabouts, looking at some aspects of how political life, political language was changing, and how intellectuals, so again, members of the elite, people employed by governments, members of the merchant classes, that kind of thing, were reacting to this, coming up with new forms of expression, new forms of writing, discourse. But at the same time, I was also involved in another project, a comparative historical project about the Age of Revolutions, which is used by historians to refer to roughly the period between 1750 and 1850, things like, most famously, the French Revolution, the American Revolution that leads to American independence, the revolution in Haiti, this slave rebellion against their French masters. So it's often been seen as a quite European or Atlantic phenomenon, this set of revolutions in the late 18th into the early 19th century. I was interested, though, in asking, okay, how can I put that together with some of these changes in political discourse, in language, that I can see happening through reading texts written in Arabic coming from Bilad al-Sham and Egypt in the 19th century? How do we fit the Middle East, but also particularly places like Mount Lebanon, into this picture of a global age of revolutions, which some historians are pointing to and arguing for? This is something not necessarily confined to Europe or to the Atlantic world. This is something which has aspects to it, resonances to it that are going elsewhere. And so I was drawn to studying these phenomena of popular rebellion, commoner collectivities in Mount Lebanon, because they seem to be a particularly interesting example of a new form of political life, which also resembled somewhat some of these demands for democracy, demands for popular participation in politics that you see coming about in European or Atlantic or other cases. So it seemed to be something that looked like it fitted into this picture of the age of revolutions. And I think it does. I mean, I have arguments that I've published around this. I think that there are ways in which you can see it responding to similar kinds of pressures to the age of revolutions in other parts of the world. The main novelty of these movements was the emergence of this new political actor, a commoner collectivity, the Amiyyat, the Jumhur Amiyyat, as it's referred to. And the language that emerges around that is based around these three terms: Amiyyat, Jumhur, and Saleh. So Amiyyat is commoners, becomes something closer to the collectivity, the institution of the commoners, the commonalty. Jumhur is used for a mass of people, a great gathering of people, or simply to refer to all of a group, the Jumhur of a group. But it becomes al-Jumhur al-Amiyyah, the assembled commoners, the mass of the commoners. And you also get in some of the language that emerges from pacts and documents of the Amiyyas, you get the term Saleh, which is used to refer to the interest of, so the good or the cause or the interest of the Jumhur or the Amiyyah. And so these three terms together represent a new kind of political actor. And the forms of actual organisation, the means by which commoners are organising themselves in these two moments in spring and autumn of 1821, are not themselves particularly novel. They're things which have been used before by the elite. You have a mass gathering of armed men, several thousand people, for instance, on the banks of the river in Antilles in the spring. You have the use of delegates, the wakils, who are delegated by a village or a group of people to represent their interests to the Jumhur, to the commoner collectivity. You have correspondence, which is used to write back and forth and report back between different villages or different groups of people. And you have particularly this use of written pacts, of which some of them survive. So where people are appointing a wakil, or they are swearing an oath of loyalty to this collectivity, the Jumhur Amiyyah, the Saleh, the interest of the commoner collectivity, and that kind of thing. And all of these forms, like pacts and delegates and correspondence and even great gatherings of people, had been used in the elite political culture of Mount Lebanon previously. They weren't particularly new in themselves. What's new is that they're being used by this new political actor, the commoner collectivity. And its emergence onto the scene. And it's this novelty that prompted me initially to say, okay, there's something similar about what's going on in Mount Lebanon in 1821 and other things one can point to in this wider age of revolutions, French Revolution or the American Revolution, whatever it is, this coming together of ordinary people claiming a voice in politics, organising through their own political forms. But what I don't think is taking place is any direct imitation of these forms of European or French revolutionary activity. I mean, this has been suggested by some. People will say, okay, the French Revolution happened in 1789. People in Lebanon were aware of this. You get this emergence of the notion of the Jumhur, the term which is used, Jumhur, to translate the French Republic, Jumhur, which later becomes Jumhuriya in Arabic. There's clearly something going on in terms of transmission. I don't think that that's actually the case. I think that the transformation happens within the political language and the political forms of organisation which already exist in Mount Lebanon, but that it's responding to pressures which are nonetheless similar ones to those which are leading to these political transformations in other parts of the world, such as France or the Atlantic world more generally. This is a rebellion against taxation, which has been increased. Taxes are going up in many other situations. The French Revolution starts with a fiscal crisis, the need to raise taxes. The main reason why states are having to raise taxes at this time is to fight wars. There's a global set of wars being fought, particularly between the British and French empires on a world scale, but also the Ottoman Empire is involved, fighting a war with Russia in the late 18th century. There's military competition between different Ottoman members of the elite governors, Ayyan as they're called. Bashir Shahabi or his superior, Jazzar Pasha, down in Akka, are very much part of that dynamic. So there's a dynamic of a rise of pressure on ordinary people from these military fiscal states, these taxing and warring states which are fighting each other and needing to draw in new resources. And that you can see is quite a general set of pressures, which is then pushing people to organise their own forms of political activity to resist or to try and push those states at least in a new kind of direction. And so I think there is a sense in which you can place these innovations, these new forms of political organisation and language in Mount Lebanon within this wider context of the Age of Revolutions. But it's not one which has been suggested by some people of a direct transmission of French ideas. I don't think that that's a particularly plausible hypothesis when you look at the sort of people engaged in these commoner rebellions. The only group that they're really in contact with which has knowledge of and a certain sort of cultural closeness to events going on in France and Europe are the Maronite clergy. And these people are counter-revolutionaries. You know, they're very much against the whole French revolutionary process because it has destroyed the power and authority of the Catholic Church in Europe. And that's the main way in which they read that process. They are, to some extent, involved in supporting or, at least, giving advice to the commoner rebels in Mount Lebanon, but they are not doing so, I think, prompted by French revolutionary examples. If anything, they would be very put off by those examples. One of them is simply the idea of a homegrown tradition of popular politics, or of what we might refer to as democratic organisation, self-organisation among ordinary people, among common people, if you like. So rather than this notion that, which one encounters, I think, in contemporary activism to some extent, that over there in Europe or the United States or somewhere else, they know about democracy, they know about how to organise radical or popular forms of politics, or how to run a political system properly, and therefore in Lebanon we need to go to them to learn. I think that at least my reading of these Amiyyat as things which are not particularly inspired by something happening in France or in the United States or somewhere in Europe, but as events which emerge from within Lebanese political traditions and which nonetheless do new things and are able to represent ordinary people and give them a place within politics for a time. I think that gives a different possibility of reading how those interactions can take place and say, okay, yes, Lebanon can be part of very much a global context of upheaval, of contestation of politics, of popular politics, other kinds of projects emerging. But this doesn't necessarily mean that the intellectual traffic needs to be one way from a centre like Paris or London or New York to somewhere like Lebanon to learn from those political examples. There are things that can be created, innovated from within a local political culture that then perhaps others can learn from as well. Now, traffic can be in the other direction too. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think, to do with the relationship of popular politics to sectarianism. Obviously, a big theme in Lebanon's subsequent history. One of the interesting things about these 1821 uprisings is that they're not particularly sectarian, that one can see. They are movements of Maronite Christian peasants. The clergy, Maronite clergy, are to some extent involved as leaders or helpers of the movement. This is happening within a context in which, across the water in Greece, there is a Christian rebellion against the Ottoman Empire and a very sharp polarization between Christians and Muslims, and people being massacred and fighting each other on that basis, very much as a Christian versus Muslim struggle. And there are repercussions on Christians from that throughout the Ottoman Empire, including along the coast of Lebanon and other parts of Ottoman Syria. Nonetheless, this rebellion in Mount Lebanon doesn't turn into a clash between Christians and Muslims or Christians and Druze. It's not really part of that kind of a sectarian dynamic. These people are representing themselves as commoners, not as Christians. They enter into negotiations with the elite, with the Ottoman governor, who are Muslims and Druze as well as Christians. They, in fact, install two new governors as a result of their pressure in the summer of 1821. Emir Bashir Shahabi, a Christian, goes into exile. These two new governors, his cousins, other members of the Shahabi family, declare themselves very ostentatiously to be Muslims and then are put into power with the support of the League of Amiyyat and of the Muslim Ottoman governor. Christian peasants involved in the League don't seem to be bothered about that. It's really not a context in which they are seeking for Christian rule or Christian representation as Christians. What they're seeking for is a reduction in taxes and a role for themselves in politics as a commoner collectivity. So the kinds of polarization that you later get, and this certainly does happen in the later evolution of this tradition of popular politics in Mount Lebanon, in which you see a popular Amiyyat that is also a sectarian one from 1841, 1860. Later on in the 19th century, that kind of pairing emerges between sectarianism and popular politics. In 1821, this isn't really the case. And so I think this allows you to separate these two things out conceptually. So again, some people back in the 19th century, as perhaps, some people today might claim, popular politics, ordinary people getting involved in the political system is a problem because it will inevitably lead to sectarianism, to violence, to demagoguery. Instead, we need to keep things in the hands of an elite political class, which is able to smooth over those disputes, to handle things responsibly, rationally. This is the kind of thing that some people are saying in the 19th century from, obviously, an elite perspective about the sectarianism that emerges in the 19th century. an example like 1821 can show you a rather different kind of picture. Say, okay, here we have an example of popular politics that is not a sectarian one. Yes, it involves armed uprising. Yes, it involves negotiation, or taking on a particular place within a politics that is still largely an elite-dominated one. But it's a different kind of model of the participation of ordinary people in politics to one that simply involves them fighting for a sectarian interest as members of a particular religious grouping. So there's a whole range of different sources which I was drawing on. Very many of them were published ones, in fact. So Lebanese historians principally have published chronicles, histories of Mount Lebanon in this period, which refer to the Amiyyat. Some of them are quite famous: the history of Haidar Ahmed al-Shahabi, the history of Tannus Shadia. Lebanese historians in largely the 20th century produced editions of these. They're quite well known. There are then less well-known documents which were also often collected by Lebanese historians or antiquaries from the time of the great antiquary Isa Skandar Ma'luf onwards. And you can find reproductions or the texts of these documents in their publications and printed collections. And these things are a bit more scattered. They're often, things like the pacts, which are sworn by the members of the Amiyyat, other documents, letters and things about the movements. And the originals are usually quite difficult to find. I mean, I haven't found very many of those originals at all. They are either in very kind of scattered collections, which are now difficult to trace, which these scholars have taken them from and published them from, or they're in something like the National Archives of Lebanon as it existed before the Civil War, which then disappeared from public view, may yet reappear, and one may be able to go and look at the originals again. But for now, you have these copies or facsimiles or the texts of these documents which were published. Another important set of sources then are held outside Lebanon in archives. So these are reports which ended up in foreign archives. For instance, reports by the French consuls, diplomats, in Tripoli are very important for dating exactly when events took place, because they're sending very regular letters back to France. These are held in French archives in Paris and Nantes. There's also a few documents in the Catholic Church archives in Rome, coming from Maronite priests in Mount Lebanon. Also an important set of sources. They're quite close to the events that are taking place. So those are in Rome. And one very interesting, rather unique source which I came across is actually held in the United States at Harvard University among the papers of the American missionary Eli Smith. And it's an account which was written for the missionaries of this rebellion by a minor Maronite sheikh called Latouf from Jubal Shari, northern Mount Lebanon. And it gives quite a sort of detailed and close account of the rebellion from somebody who, if he wasn't involved himself, was probably quite close to those who were involved. So that's another account which has ended up in a somewhat unexpected place in this missionary set of papers at Harvard University. So again, from a number of these different perspectives, you can piece things together. And in some ways, work around the absence of a sort of unified set of national documentary sources in Lebanon itself, which doesn't really exist. But it does involve piecing together lots of perspectives from different places.